What's up, guys? We left off last time with a single-player Pong game that looked like this. We've got a paddle on the right, and I'm moving it with my up and down keys on the keyboard. The ball bounces off the paddle. It also bounces off the top left or bottom, but it doesn't bounce off the right side. It keeps going, and you lose. Sometimes you can get it to come back by moving where it was in this strange, buggy way. Maybe I can replicate that. Let me see. And that's because our collision is horrible. We'll work on a nicer instance. You see that? It went off screen, and then I could make it come back by just moving in a certain way, and we'll see how that goes. Collision is always the hardest part of this kind of thing, and you may notice in games you play that you complain about, oh, the enemy hit you when it didn't really look like it had, or something. Now, what we're going to do today, as you can see from the file name, is we're going to make a two-player version. And in some ways that's really easy, because if I want to make another paddle, I can just say paddle and create another instance, right? Let's call it paddle left. And I don't have to type any of this stuff again, because this is all creating a new object with the same qualities that the first one had. And so we're going to give it the X and Y. Why not space it out? With probably 0x, because it's going to be on the left, and then y, I don't know why I just pick 100 for these numbers sometimes. That means it's going to start around here-ish, and then it's not going to appear yet until we say paddle left dot update, because when it does the update, it's going to do the hide, the move, and the show, which draws it and then puts the background back in order to redraw it in a new spot. So I think if we hit run, we'll see it. Obviously not with fully functional setup, but there it is. And in fact, if I move the keys, it's going to move left and right paddles up and down, because they both have the up, move down situation. It's not really bouncing off the left paddle, it's just bouncing off the left wall. And we need to set up the collision, hopefully making it less complicated and not more. Now let's see what we can do with this. First of all, I think I want to change the name of this guy, because it was fine when it was the only paddle, but now that it's the right one, I don't want it to be called paddle. And when I look at it, or when somebody looks at it, we have to slow down for a second every time our eyes cross that and go, wait, which one is it? You know, I don't want to do that. So theoretically, this would be the only time we have to change the name, and the rest of the code wouldn't mind. It wouldn't have to know what the name of some object is. But because we set this up in a less than perfect way earlier, it does mention the name around here, and so we'll have to change those. Now let's say we want to get the paddle collision. Let's say we want to get it to bounce so that the ball will properly bounce when it hits the left paddle and go by when it hits the left side. This is the ugly part. The ball, right now the ball handles all the work, right? It's not asking the paddle to tell it yes or no, am I hitting you? It's just reaching in the paddle and saying, give me your attributes, give me your height and width and X and Y, and I'll figure it out, which is not very nice. You want to let the paddle handle its business. So hopefully we can change that. But for now, let's just copy it and do the ugly way to make sure it works. I'm going to copy this chunk right here, and I'm going to switch it out. We don't need the left wall anymore, because there is no left wall. I'm going to say different comment. And so now we have to change these, and this is really ugly, like I said. So the left side of the ball hitting the right side of the left paddle is going to be minus, and switch that, because you're going to say that X is the middle, minus radius going left is hitting the paddle, and then paddle Y, this stuff is going to be the same, because this is telling whether it's in the Y range, whether it's not above and not below. However, we do need this stuff. See how this is getting even longer and even uglier when it was already the longest and ugliest? No good. No good. So this is the kind of thing where sometimes you type a little quick and dirty mathy part to make it just see what happens, just do the brute force work, and then later we'll arrange it in a nicer way that will require less thought to make, less thought to look at later, less chance of things going wrong, and so on. Less scrolling when you look at it. So if I hit run now, I think it's going to be pretty good, unless I missed one of the copy-paste things. It's still moving in tandem. Like when I hit down, they both move down because they both have the same control. But if you notice, it's not bouncing the way it should because this is going into the paddle, whereas that one was bouncing on the edge. This one is like going through it. And that, I just realized, is because of this part. Paddle left X is the top left corner. Like when you do a rectangle in Pygame, you give it the top left corner, and then how much does it go over and how much does it go down. So when we were hitting the right paddle, it was fine to use the X coordinate for the top left, but when we're hitting the left paddle, we have to do another thing to make it even longer and even uglier. Really stressing that we got to change this part, right? So we're going to say plus paddle left dot width. Oh my gosh. Let's just test it. And boom, it is bouncing nicely. Okay, so now let's say we got to control these guys. We got to make it so that I can move, or somebody can move the other paddle with, you know, maybe W and S to go up and down, and then the right one will still be the up and down keys. Now that all happens here. In the long term, when we make a bigger game, we want to have the events and the inputs handled in their own section instead of each object taking a turn, you know, because if we had like a guy who can run and jump and shoot fireballs, we wouldn't want to get all the events in all those different parts of his methods. You know, we'd rather get the events once and then send it off like, hey, you need to do this frame. But for now, we'll keep it this way because it is the only spot that's getting input. And as you're about to see, this is going to get ugly and we're going to have to redo it anyway. So that'll be part of it. This stuff is fine, but we need like another chunk. We need like, well, if it's the left guy, then it does this other thing. So how does the paddle know if it's left or right? We could say if self.x equals something, but that would be horrible. I'm going to do something slightly less horrible, which is when we create it, we tell it. We'll be like, you're an L or you're an R. You know, that's like it's, I don't know, it's gender or something. The L and R is going to be, are you right or are you left? And then we can say, if it's left or right, then it does a certain thing. That's not great. That's horrible. I want to start with this, and then later we'll find an elegant version. We could make two different types. Like there could be a left paddle and a right paddle that both inherit most of their stuff from a paddle class and then change one thing. Or we could find some other way of setting it up. But let's say it's going to get the side, and that's the L or R thing, because it's fine to type something quickly and test it out just to make sure the concept is there. It's not fine to stick with it. You know, if we had this and then kept this going for 3 different versions, and then the program got really big and then we had to go back and change it, that would be no fun. But if it's just like, hey, type something for 45 seconds and try it, and then go back and do a nicer way, that's okay. So let's say that if self.side is R, we do this stuff. And if self.side is L, we do this stuff, which means we're going to change these to, let's say W and S. And if you ever find yourself with like a bunch of ifs within ifs, that's usually a sign that, you know, it could be nicer. So let's test it though, make sure we didn't mess anything up. Let's make sure the right one is still good, and it is, and the left one is still good, but I went in the wrong direction. Oh, look at that. It came back after being off screen. That's part of that same bug that I mentioned earlier. There's another one that I might be able to get, which is like if it hits the paddle at a certain angle, it can get stuck inside of it and bounce back and forth. Yeah, it happened for just a moment. And that's because our collision is so naive. Like, it doesn't take into account all the situations. If this stops you from hitting it and then it bounces you away from the paddle, you're kind of okay. But if you go past it or you go inside it, this doesn't take into account what can happen. And so it might have you change direction when you shouldn't, or it might have you change direction back and forth a couple times really quickly. So we want to fix that. Let's say we want to take another shot at this. Now, Pygame has collision. Pygame has almost everything you'll do will be in rectangles. And the rectangles have something called collide rect, where you just say, hey, is this touching this? It'll say yes or no. However, we are not set up for that. We don't have the rectangle for these guys. And I want to save that for a slightly later lesson when we've got a few other things set up and a few other things that we've learned. The direction, when you go into that, getting the rects and then also getting sprites. There's a thing called sprites, which you may have heard of when talking about Mario or whatever, which is an image for something on the screen that handles the background in a nicer way. Whenever we have this and our thing disappears, it just puts a solid color, which is fine if the background is a solid color. But if it wasn't, if it was a picture of a forest, we wouldn't be able to use this system for having our guy disappear and then redraw, where sprites can. So we're going to get into that and use the rect as a side effect of the sprites, basically. For now, I want to get to something that we just homebrew, that we just make our own little collide function with simple stuff. And the way I want to do that is I want to be able to ask the paddle, am I touching you, yes or no? And it will say yes, then we bounce, and it'll say no, and we don't. So in order to do that, I want to make a method in the paddle class, and I'll call it collide, and it's going to get self, and then it's going to get, we could send it the whole thing. We could like send it the whole circle and say, is this circle touching you? But I'm actually just going to send it a point, or not even a point. Let's do X and Y separately. And then it can say, is that point inside the rectangle, basically. Now, that means we're going to do something that's kind of like this, but a little bit nicer, because we don't have to handle this nonsense in here. When this gets a point, it's going to be a point. It's not going to have to add radius to it or whatever. So I'm going to say, let's break it up into two parts. Let's do the X and Y separately. Like, we could say return and then a big long line, but I'm going to say within X is something, within Y is something, and then I'm going to return within X and within Y. Those are dumb names. Maybe we'll change them, but that's the idea. So within X is like, hey, we're going to send you a point. Is that overlapping with the rectangle? And how do we check that? Well, we say X is less than something is less than something. Like, are you between something and something? So the left side is just self.x. And remember, in this case, we're in the paddle. The paddle's handling this. So self means the paddle. And then the other side is plus width, and then the other side, the other dimension is exactly the same thing. We've talked about how y is kind of upside down, like y starts at 0 up here and then goes downward, but in this case it doesn't matter. We don't have to know what this means, we just have to know that we're doing some math, which is really nice. So this is going to do the job. We're going to send it a point and it's going to say yes or no, this point overlaps with me. And now we can cut this way down and just say, hey paddle, am I touching you? That's nice because this line is short. It's nice because this thing is doing some of the work, and it's also nice because the bounce doesn't have to know all the details. It doesn't have to know that paddle left has a thing called X and a thing called width and a thing called whatever. It just has to know one thing. And that thing has a nice descriptive name. So let's say I'm going to delete this whole ugly guy. And I'm going to say if paddle left collide, and then we have to supply it with the point. So the point is going to be that, which maybe we can get rid of that. We'll see in a minute. And then it's going to do the same thing. But imagine going from that horrible long line to this. This is fairly descriptive. When you see dot collide, you go, oh yeah, it's telling if you collide with paddle left. And it has less going on here. We don't have to do much calculation in the ball. We just send it off to have the work done where it makes sense. Now this is not amazing or anything, but it's a nice start. And then for here, I'm going to do the same thing. We don't want any of this. We want to say paddle right dot collide, and then we go self dot x plus. And that, if I didn't make any typos, is going to do the job. So let's hit run to make sure. You always want to test things as often as you can. Oh, we got invalid syntax. I think I missed parentheses. Yep, even where my cursor was. Okay, so it bounces. It bounces. Let's see if it sails by when it should sail by. Yeah. And it doesn't have that bug anymore where it'll come back around because it's not testing, are you past this point? Which is true even way off screen. But it's testing, are you inside this whole thing? So it's more solid in its performance in addition to being more solid in its visuals. Now, this is still not amazing. Like if you were typing this, you'd still have to do calculation in your head and go, okay, what am I sending? I'm sending the leftmost point of the ball, which is self.x minus radius, because you're starting in the middle and going over. So if I were being really thorough, I might add another thing and say left. And then do this. And then I might add a thing called right. And then do this. And then I could just say, hey, left, whatever that is. And that is way nicer right here because you can sort of outsource the work. You can say, I don't remember how to find the left, but I remember that I made it. So this will return whatever the leftmost point of the ball is at the moment. And you can't do that in the init because it changes. The leftmost point is different now than it was at the beginning, than it was 1 frame ago. But you can make it as a method, which means you need parentheses. Now let me test that just to make sure I didn't ruin it. Oh, it doesn't like it. What is this? Collide int and none type. So it was it was having a none because I didn't return anything. Functions in Python return none as a default. Some languages, you see that? That was a little wonky. Some languages have a separate thing, like they'll call it a procedure if it doesn't return, and they'll only call it a function if it spits out an answer. But Python just says, whatever, man, they're all the same. Which means that it doesn't tell you if you forget it. Like, it doesn't tell me that I forgot the return. We just have to see that it crashes somewhere else. Ooh, okay, these are fine. Let's make it go off screen. Okay, there was still a little bug where it was like jaggedly bouncing back and forth for a second inside the very edge of the paddle, and that's probably because of my less than and greater than stuff. Like, it might be going 1 pixel too far. Maybe I should say less than or equal to and greater than or equal to and that kind of thing. But I'm not sure, and I don't want to mess with it. There's an issue of speed. Like, if it moves so much per pixel, you might check after it's gone too far, you know, and then it might be too late to turn around or something. So we could add a predictor, like looking ahead and bouncing before we actually hit it, or we could add a little function that like will snap the, like, you know, on Windows when you're putting stuff in the desktop and it allows you to snap to grid and it'll like put it in the perfectly right spot. We could have it snap 2 objects to be right next to each other but not overlapping when they would. We can try a lot of things, but this doesn't really become a huge problem when you have things moving at a constant speed. It does if you have them accelerating and something gets really fast and then it like falls through the floor. Then we can talk about the consequences. But I'm going to leave this off here because we've got a good working 2-player Pong, and we've got a much less ugly bounce function. The collision is what I hated. Oh my gosh, I still hate that. The collision is what I hated in the first draft with the 1-player, and now we've got more going on. It's doing 2 players, 2 paddles, so it's doing more work, and it's better because it's not going to come back after it leaves the screen. But it's much, much nicer because we've added the abstractions and we've offloaded some things to happen here, and to be a little more object-oriented so that we can ask the paddle, hey, am I touching you? Instead of asking it, hey, what's your X and what's your Y and what's your height? And it asks, what are you going to do with it? And you say, none of your business. We don't like that. So this is a good stopping point for our 2-player version 1, which will eventually become a 2-player, much nicer thing in the future.